She betrayed me before I ever thought of betraying her. For months, she lived a double life, smiling to my face while giving her heart to another man. But when the truth surfaced, I didn't just walk away. I made sure she lost everything she valued most. This isn't just a story about infidelity. It's about revenge, about reclaiming your dignity, and about finding the strength to rebuild from the ashes. And trust me, the twist you're about to hear will leave you stunned until the very last second. This is She Betrayed Me First, but my revenge made her lose everything here on Cheating Stories 7. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, because this one is going to get people talking. Now, let's dive into the story. I was 26, but I felt old in ways that didn't leave visible marks on a face. My mornings began with the cold punch of the warehouse time clock, my nights swallowed by the hum of the rideshare app. 70, sometimes 80 hours a week, two jobs wound together into a single rope I kept pulling, hand over hand, toward a future that always seemed to inch further away instead of closer. To me, that was what love looked like back then. Receipts stuffed into a shoebox, a color-coded spreadsheet with green cells for money saved and red for overdue bills, and a quiet promise to myself that if I just worked hard enough, we would get our papers, our permanence, and a life that would finally feel settled. Marissa told me she understood. She was 30, sharp in both mind and presence, the kind of woman who could turn a boardroom meeting by asking one perfectly timed question. In the early years of our marriage, her laugh filled every corner of our apartment. Our bed felt like a map we redrew each night, but lately it had turned into something colder, two roommates sharing bills instead of lovers sharing a life. I came home after the sun had disappeared, the coffee pot cold and empty, the kind of exhaustion clinging to my bones that no nap could fix. Marissa would be sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone, a half-full wine glass at her elbow, dinner covered with plastic wrap as if waiting for someone who might not show. I tried to reclaim what the week had taken from us. On Sundays, I cooked breakfast, eggs, toast, fresh fruit, asking about her clients and pretending I cared about the answer more than the weight in her voice. I fixed the dripping faucet. I bought her lilies when the budget allowed. I told myself these small gestures were proof that I was still here, still choosing us. But a bed can feel unbearably crowded when silence is the third occupant. The space between us grew the way cracks spread across parched earth, starting as fine lines, widening almost imperceptibly, inevitable if you stared long enough. The first time she turned me down, I let it go. The second time, I made a joke about my timing and kissed her forehead. The third time I asked if we were okay, she sighed in that way that makes a room colder. "I'm tired," she said. "I feel unseen." I wanted to tell her I saw everything, the way she folded towels into perfect thirds, the subtle tension in her mouth when reading an email from her boss, the faint silver scar on her left knee from a childhood fall. But I didn't say any of that. I just told her I would try. Trying became its own form of work. I set alarms on my phone to send her good morning texts during my break. Once, I left work early to surprise her with a reservation at the sushi place on Willow. She opened the door in leggings and an oversized sweater, hair in a messy knot, her eyes already delivering the answer before her mouth did. "I've had a day," she said. "Let's not." The reservation went unused. I ate leftovers from the night before, telling her it was fine. I was always telling her it was fine, as if repetition could fill the hollow. Money pressed against us from all sides. The visa fund still needed thousands more. The car needed new brakes. Rent had gone up again because the city could. I picked up more shifts. She picked up her phone. At night, she lay beside me bathed in the cold blue glow of her screen, the light painting her cheekbones, her pupils reflecting whatever world lived in those messages. When I asked who she was texting, she said, "Just work," angling the phone away like the act itself was nothing. I wanted to believe her, and so I chose belief, the way a thirsty man chooses a mirage. At first, we argued in whispers so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Eventually, we stopped caring who listened. She told me I'd pushed her so far away she couldn't see me anymore. I told her the pushing wasn't the point, that I was building a raft for both of us to stand on. She asked if I'd been taking care of myself, the way men sometimes do when their wives say no. I told her the truth, that after weeks without intimacy, I had. She looked at me like I'd confessed to a crime I didn't commit, muttered, "So you do have energy," and walked away. I began counting the ways I could be better, more notes on the fridge, more dishes done even when my wrists ached, folding the laundry hot from the dryer so her favorite shirts wouldn't wrinkle. I told myself small things add up, but so do absences. Every time I reached for her and found only air, something inside me learned to stop reaching. One night, traffic had mercy on me and I arrived home earlier than usual. The apartment was too quiet. The air carried the faint bite of citrus cleaner she liked, and something else I couldn't name. On the counter, 2 wine glasses, one in the sink with a crescent of lipstick, one drying on the rack. I told myself I was inventing stories. People own more than one glass. People rinse one and leave the other out. 10 minutes later, she came in with damp hair and a brightness in her voice that didn't match the hour. I wanted to ask the question already formed on my tongue, but I swallowed it. I'd been swallowing a lot lately. That night, she suggested a vacation, just the 2 of us somewhere with water. "We need to reset," she said. "Get out of this routine." It sounded like salvation. I said yes before she'd even finished. When she looked at me, there was something in her gaze I couldn't quite name, not guilt, not excitement. A calculation, maybe, like a person checking the weather before deciding which shoes to wear. It passed quickly. She squeezed my hand. "I miss us," she said. I squeezed back and told her I missed us too. That night I lay awake listening to the refrigerator hum and traffic curling past our building. I pictured water the color of bottled glass, a horizon wide enough for both our names. I told myself the trip would fix what time had loosened, that salt air and sleep could do what apologies hadn't. In the dark, her phone lit up and went dark again. I closed my eyes and chose belief one more time. We used to eat dinner facing the window, knees brushing under the table, inventing little stories about strangers passing on the sidewalk. That was our game. Spot someone, imagine their life, give them names and habits and entire histories in the time it took for them to cross our line of sight. Now our chairs had drifted like continents. Hers angled toward the TV, mine toward the dark hallway, as if even the furniture expected one of us to leave. Dinner had become an exercise in inventory. Protein, starch, vegetable, plates down, forks up. The soundscape reduced to the quiet clink of utensils and the soft, rhythmic tap of her nails against her phone screen. Her phone seemed to know exactly when to demand her attention. It would buzz once, maybe twice, and her face would shift. Just a flicker, a small lift at the corner of her mouth, the kind of smile you give to an inside joke. I asked who it was because that's what a husband asks. She gave me names I didn't know or vague answers. A client, a friend choosing a dress, someone from work who can't format a slide deck. Busy people have busy phones, I told myself, and I repeated it until it almost sounded like truth. Touch became its own complicated terrain. I would slip an arm around her waist while she was rinsing dishes, and her body would stiffen just enough for me to feel it. She'd pat my wrist lightly, like a gentle no, and step away with an apology that never explained what she was sorry for. I started keeping a quiet mental list of her reasons. Headache, early meeting, deadline, not in the mood. The excuses changed outfits, but the answer was always the same. I tried to make closeness easy. Suggested a walk after dinner. She had emails. Friday night at the new Thai place, she'd promised to help a coworker move offices. Saturday brunch too tired. A matinee too loud. A long drive with the windows down, maybe next week. Next week became a country we never visited, a stamp that never touched our passports. At night, the distance was even sharper. We had once fallen asleep in a tangle of limbs, stealing each other's pillow corners, finding each other's feet under the covers. Now, bedtime had turned into choreography. Her lamp clicked off, her back turned. The duvet pulled to her chin in one smooth motion. I would lie there, listening to her breathing, counting the seconds like you count the gap between lightning and thunder, waiting for the distance to close. When I inched closer, she seemed to drift further away, as though our bodies had learned a new law of physics, like charges repel. In the mornings, I tried to leave a breadcrumb trail back to us. Coffee set to brew before she woke. A sticky note by the sink. "You've got this presentation today. Where the green blouse, it's lucky." A screenshot of cheap flights to somewhere warmer, sent with a joke about my vampire complexion. She'd smile, say thank you, and tuck the note into her blazer pocket. That pocket might as well have been a well. Nothing I put there ever seemed to echo back. Work carved new hollows in me. On the bus, I'd catch my reflection in the darkened window and barely recognize the man looking back. Eyes ringed with fatigue, jaw set too tight, hair longer than I liked because I kept missing appointments. I told myself presence would beat absence, that if I were more attentive in the hours I had, the hours I didn't have would matter less. I cut a shift once thinking time was the missing ingredient, but the bills and the rent reminded me they didn't care about romance. The visa fund didn't care about our marriage, so I picked the shift back up. One evening, I opened the door to candlelight. Small glass votives lined the mantel, flickering shadows on the wall. For a moment, I thought maybe this was the turning point, the night we stopped drifting. She had made pasta and opened a bottle of wine. We ate slowly, talking about a podcast she liked. At one point, she reached across the table and touched my forearm, quick as a moth landing on a porch light. The touch startled both of us. I cleared the plates. She leaned against the counter, watching. I kissed her carefully, like I was handling something fragile, and she kissed me back. In that moment, I felt hope and the outline of its limits both pressed between us. But hope, I was learning, is not a plan. A week later, she started taking long showers at strange hours, late at night, right after I left for work in the morning. She'd emerge pink-cheeked, hair damp, smelling faintly of orange blossom, a perfume she'd once reserved for special occasions. I asked if she'd changed shampoo. She said the store was out of her usual, brushing past me into the bedroom. The towel bar gleamed with fresh damp. The mirror fogged and cleared. The distance stayed. Our arguments lost their prefaces. She said she'd told me for months she was unhappy. I said I'd been searching for solutions while she was mapping her exits. She said I made her feel invisible. I said I'd turned myself inside out to prove she wasn't. A small voice in my head kept whispering, "This isn't a competition." But our sentences still landed like points, tallied silently for some invisible scoreboard. After midnight, she rolled toward me in bed, placed her palm flat against my chest, the heel of her hand pressing into my sternum. I woke instantly. Her fingers traced a slow line down my ribs, paused at the sheet's edge. I waited. She whispered, "I can't do this," and turned away. In the dark, I stared at the ceiling, counting shadows cast by the streetlight until a pale gray began to bleed into the blinds. Lucas called the next day to check in. I told him we were fine because I didn't know how to explain the kind of slow shrinking that doesn't make headlines. People rally at the start of a crisis when problems are neat and fixable. They drift away when the crisis becomes your normal. I told Lucas we were thinking about a trip. He said it sounded like a good idea. Saying it out loud made it feel possible. That evening, she texted me a photo of a beach, sky rinsed clean, sand bright, captioned simply, "I need sun." I sent back a thumbs up and a joke. She replied with a heart emoji, then went quiet for hours. When I got home, she was humming softly as she folded laundry. Between shirts, she checked her phone the way someone checks a simmering pot. I asked if she wanted to watch the sunset from the footbridge. She said she'd promised someone she would call. Someone, not a name. I nodded. Nodding had become the easiest answer in my vocabulary. I kept trying to rename what lay between us. A season, a rough patch, bad weather that would eventually pass. But deep down, I knew her days no longer curved toward mine. Her smiles arrived late and left early. And when I reached for her in the dark, all I found was the warm dent where she had been. We chose the coast because water, from a distance, looks like forgiveness. It has that deceptive calm, the illusion that something vast and unpredictable can wash away what's broken and return it as new. We rented a small cottage with weathered shingles, a single line of dunes between us and the ocean, and a narrow boardwalk that rattled when the wind caught it. Marissa said the ocean would rinse us clean. I wanted to believe her, so I did. The first afternoon, we carried our bags inside and opened every window. Salt air drifted through the rooms, lifting the curtains in slow, almost reverent movements as if blessing the house. We unpacked side by side without touching. She hung her dresses with careful hands, smoothing each hem flat before stepping back to admire the line. Then she placed her phone face down on the dresser, like a promise she might keep if she tried hard enough. I stacked my shirts in the closet, told her I'd handle the grill later. She smiled with that tired brightness of someone striking damp matches, hoping for a flame. "Let's make this work," she said. "Yes," I answered and felt the word float between us like a balloon no one reached for. For a few hours, we remembered us. We walked the shoreline barefoot, shoes in hand, dodging bits of driftwood and small mounds of shells. She asked about a coworker I rarely mentioned. I asked about the book she'd been reading for months. The wind stole half our words and carried them away, but the ones that stayed felt warmer than they had in weeks. When the tide pushed in and soaked our cuffs, we laughed, brief, clean, unguarded. That evening we stood on the small deck, watching the sun sink into the horizon, the sky bleeding gold into deepening blue. I lit the grill. She poured wine. We ate from paper plates, knees brushing beneath the table, the breeze carrying the smell of charred food and salt. I leaned in to kiss her, slow, cautious, like approaching a skittish animal. For one breath, she leaned back, then her phone hummed. She flinched as if the sound had teeth. "Work," she said, already standing. 5 minutes. She stepped inside, closing the sliding door gently like someone who didn't want to disturb an idea. 5 minutes stretched like cooling wax. The grill went cold. The sky finished its work without us. When she returned, her smile was polite, her apology thin. "Crisis," she said, waving the word away. "Sorry, I'm here now." We finished dinner without scraping our forks against the plates. The next morning, we planned a drive up the coast to a lighthouse. She dressed for the beach but took a call on the back steps, head bowed, voice pitched low. I lingered at the kitchen window, pretending to rinse a mug that was already clean. Her laughter floated in private, soft, and stopped the moment she saw me reflected in the glass. "Another client," she said, brushing past me with a kiss aimed somewhere near my cheek. "Give me 10. 10 became 30. The lighthouse waited for people who never arrived. That night, the shower ran like steady rain. She left her phone on the dresser again, trusting habit to protect it. I wasn't looking for anything. My hands didn't touch it, but the screen lit just long enough to spill a message into the room. "D.H. Can't wait to see you again. My name is not D.H. My stomach folded in on itself. I replayed the words into different meanings. Co-worker after a conference, cousin in town, until the effort made my jaw ache. When she stepped out, steam following her like a cloak, orange blossom clinging to her skin, she found me at the window. She slipped her arms around my waist. "You're quiet," she said. "The ocean does that to me," I told her. She hummed, the sound not matching the conversation I was having silently in my head. I kissed her damp hairline. The message burned behind my eyes like the afterimage of staring at the sun. The next day we tried again. Towels under our arms, a cooler packed with grapes and cheese, sunscreen that always left me looking chalky. On the sand, she propped her phone in the shade of her bag. "Just one quick email," she said. I built a lopsided sandcastle with a forgotten plastic bucket, pretending to care about turrets and walls. Every few minutes, her phone lit. Her fingers danced across the screen like a pianist playing a familiar song. Once she laughed, soft, reflexive, then caught herself and glanced at me as if I were a mirror that might tattle. "Memes," she said. "My team is ridiculous." "Teams usually are," I replied. We swam, we dried off. We spoke about everything except the things that needed saying. When I reached for her hand on the blanket, she intertwined her fingers with mine, but her gaze was far away, following some invisible current just offshore. By evening, back at the cottage, she announced another work call and disappeared into the bedroom. I shook sand from our shoes, rinsed the cooler, Listen to the house make its small noises, pipes clearing their throats, wood settling. I told myself that some jobs owned your weekends. I told myself stress made people reach for distractions. I told myself the message I saw could be explained by context I didn't have. The human brain can build excuses like sandbags when the flood is love. When she came back, she climbed onto my lap, tucking her face into my neck. For a few minutes, we felt simple again. We cooked together, garlic popping in oil, pasta water rolling to a boil. She mouthed the lyrics to a song playing softly from her phone, one I didn't recognize. When I asked, she shrugged. Playlist from a friend. She didn't say which friend, I didn't ask. That night, sleep came in fragments. At 2 a.m., her phone lit the ceiling with a pale blue square, then went dark. In the morning, she was already dressed, smiling into the day. Over breakfast, she showed me photos of a cove we could kayak to, a cafe with lemon tarts worth the trip. Her eyes sparkled, not with the sunrise, but with something promised elsewhere. Later, while she brushed her hair in the mirror, another message arrived. D.H. Tomorrow works. She tilted the phone away with casual precision. My name was still not D.H. The cottage seemed to shift around me, its wooden frame settling with soft pops as if it knew before I did. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I poured coffee, adding sugar the way she liked, kissed her shoulder where her robe had slipped, and watched the steam from our cups rise together, only to peel apart and find their own paths to the open window. We stepped outside into a morning so bright it felt staged. The ocean breathed its endless, patient breath. Somewhere beyond those waves, a plan I hadn't agreed to was already unfolding. I told myself we had come here to be saved, but maybe salvage sometimes looks like pretending for one more day. She squeezed my hand, grateful or guilty, I couldn't tell, and led me toward the beach. The boardwalk rattled under our feet. The gulls wheeled above, crying out into the wind, indifferent to who we were or what we carried. We walked, and the distance between our footprints told the truth we both refused to say aloud. Afternoons at the cottage had their own kind of weather. The light didn't just enter the room. It filtered in slowly, stretching in long, pale bars through the blinds, making the wooden floor warm under bare feet. Outside, the ocean kept its constant, patient breathing, while inside, the kettle hissed like it had something urgent to say. Marissa was in the shower, singing softly under her breath, some pop tune looping over and over, like a ribbon caught in the wind. I wasn't looking for trouble that day. I'd only meant to grab a sweater from the dresser, rinse 2 mugs, and wait on the deck until the steam cleared from the bathroom. But her laptop was there, open on the vanity stool. Its screen had dimmed, but a soft notification pulse blinked in the corner like a heartbeat. I told myself not to look. I told myself it was nothing. The touchpad woke with the brush of my hand as I moved the sweater. And there it was, a chat window, heavy with blue and gray bubbles, filling the screen like a private storm system. Words stacked on words, too familiar, too intimate to be work. The name at the top, Damon Hayes, a small profile picture, office lighting, a polished smile. The first lines I saw made my skin prickle. Inside jokes I'd never heard. Plans for days I didn't know about. A photograph of a man's hand at her hip bone in a cropped shot that revealed just enough to remove doubt. And then the words that seemed to ring inside my skull, "You make me feel seen." Her reply followed immediately. "I'm counting hours." It felt like the air in the room shifted, tilting toward me in slow, suffocating waves. My vision tunneled until the only thing left in focus were those words, sharp as if cut from metal. I had the absurd thought that if I just scrolled up, I'd find a piece of the story that made it all less damaging, a preface that explained this away. But there was only more of the same. More late-night messages, more photos, more of the life she'd been building somewhere else. A voice inside me, a voice that still wanted to be decent, told me to close it, walk away, be better than this moment. My hand hovered. My hand failed. The water in the shower stopped. Pipes knocked in the walls, modest and domestic, as if apologizing for carrying something darker. I stepped back from the laptop and caught my own reflection in the mirror. The same face I'd seen every morning, except for the new, fixed line at the mouth, the hardening around the eyes. I could have put the lid down and pretended not to know. People do it all the time, small denials, large ones. But my hand closed the laptop instead, not to erase what I'd seen, but to keep it contained like a dangerous chemical sealed away from the air. When she came out, her skin was flushed, smelling faintly of orange blossom and borrowed hours. "Hey," she said lightly, pressing a kiss to my shoulder as if nothing had shifted in the air between us. I couldn't summon an ordinary reply. She read the quiet immediately. She always had that skill. "What's wrong?" she asked, already bracing herself like someone turning sideways to take a wave. I picked up the laptop, set it on the bed between us. "Who's dammin'?" I asked. No performance, no preamble. The name was a bell I couldn't unring. For a fleeting second, something unguarded crossed her face. Relief, maybe, like the release of a secret that had grown heavier than the guilt of keeping it. She didn't reach for the machine. She didn't spin up a lie that would require another to survive. She just sat on the mattress edge, eyes lowered to her hands. "He works with me," she said. "We started talking. It felt easy. I didn't plan any of it. I thought about all the parts of our life that needed careful planning, budgets, calendars, the endless logistics of two people trying to survive in an expensive city, and how this somehow had slipped through all the gates." "How long?" I asked. "Months," she said, barely audible. She stopped herself from adding a word that would only make me angrier. "At first, it was just attention, someone who asked questions and listened to the answers. He made me feel like the version of myself I liked best." "You mean he made you feel loved?" I said. The word tasted like aluminum. She nodded slowly. "I've been trying to tell you I felt alone," she said. "You heard me, but you were too tired to change anything. I was tired, too tired of feeling like I was penciled into your schedule instead of being in your life. You could have told me before you crossed the line," I said. My voice was calm, almost conversational, because pain sometimes arrives that way, already knowing it's going to stay a while. She looked up, eyes shimmering. "I know I should have. I thought I'd stop before it became what it became, but then it did, and I didn't want to look at myself too closely. I saw it all then, her on the back steps, her laughter going silent when she noticed me in the window reflection, the perfume that had crept into ordinary days. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't been imagining shadows. "Do you want to stay married to me?" I asked. Her gaze shifted toward the ceiling as though the answer might be written there. "I want the feeling I had when we were us," she said. "I don't know if this version of us can get back there." "I won't share you," I said. My voice had steel in it I hadn't heard in years. "If you want this marriage, you end it completely. No friendship, no slow fade. Cut it off. If you can't, tell me and I'll make the choice for both of us." She pressed her palms together, eyes wet. "I don't want to hurt you again, but I don't want to promise something I can't keep." "Take until dinner," I said, standing. "Decide if you can let him go. If you can't, we end this." I returned the laptop to the vanity, closed it gently, as if being rough would make me part of the damage. Our eyes met in the mirror. Two people who once believed love could carry anything, now learning it could also be the thing that breaks you. Outside, the light had shifted. The ocean kept gathering and laying itself down over and over, indifferent to the wreckage just a few steps inland. We didn't leave the cottage that day. The hours folded in on themselves, corners of time catching on unspoken words. The light shifted from morning to afternoon in slow gradients, stretching across the wooden floor like it was trying to escape the air between us. Marissa cried the way people cry when they are startled by their own grief, palms pressed to her eyes as if she could keep everything from spilling out just by holding it in place. Her voice broke when she said, "I love you. I do. I've always loved you, but I feel empty in this marriage." The word empty landed between us like an open container, silently demanding to be filled with meaning. I could have met her with a ledger, hours worked, bills paid, the Visa fund inching forward cell by cell in the spreadsheet, all the small sacrifices I'd made without asking for applause. Instead, I asked the question she didn't want to define. "Tell me what empty means." She spoke of coming home to find me asleep on the couch with my shoes still on, of cooking for one at a table meant for two, of conversations that began with calendars and ended with alarms. She described our life like a room lit by a single bulb, dimmed to save power, every corner heavy with shadows. Then came the geometry of blame. You weren't there when I needed you, she said. Even when you were here, your head was somewhere else. I nodded, because part of it was true. Exhaustion had its own voice, and I had let it speak for me too often, but the truth had another edge. Not being enough is different from not being faithful, I said. You could have told me before you crossed the line. She looked away, and the silence that followed said she knew. Her apology felt like a coat she was trying on for fit, something she could slip out of just as easily. I should have been honest, she said. I should have told you I was drowning. But she didn't say she would cut him off. The words kept circling back to feelings, hers, then mine, without ever touching the ground where decisions live. When I asked directly whether she would stop seeing Damon, she stared at her wedding band as if it belonged to someone else. I can't make that promise right now, she said, her voice small, precise, almost legal. He listened when I felt invisible. He made me feel wanted. I don't know how to switch that off like a lamp. It hit me then. A person can be sorry and still choose the thing that breaks you. I told her I was trying to forgive. That forgiveness for me started with a closed door and a quiet phone. She stared at the kettle as it began to tremble toward a boil. I need time, she said again, as though time was a neutral thing and not a hallway she was using to keep us both from entering the room where the decision waited. We walked the damp edge of the beach because the cottage felt too small to hold us. Gulls picked through seaweed like cynical ushers. She threaded her arm through mine with the ease of muscle memory. I hate that I hurt you, she said softly. I hate who I became. I don't even recognize that version of me. I didn't say what I was thinking, that I recognized her just fine, the woman who wanted a bridge that could carry her in two directions at once. Back at the cottage, she set her phone face down on the table, as if the gesture could stand in for the act itself. I wanted to believe it, but when the phone buzzed once, just once, she flinched. We both watched it like it was an animal choosing which way to run. Do you want me or do you want the attention? I asked. The question came out cleaner than I expected. She hesitated, then said, I want you. I want the version of us that wasn't always tired. There's no way back to the beginning, I told her. Forward means this ends or we end. Her wince was small but sharp, like a splinter working its way deeper under the skin. She disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a small wooden box I recognized, the place where she kept mementos she couldn't quite throw away. From it, she pulled a Polaroid of us at the county fair, confetti in our hair, my arm around her shoulders, her laugh frozen mid-breath. I don't want to lose this, she said. Then stop choosing what's killing it, I answered. Evening fell over us, the lights soft and heavy. We cooked without speaking, our movements choreographed by years of habit, her at the cutting board, me at the stove. Finally, she spoke again, her apology now laced with justification. It didn't start physical, she said, as if the order of events could serve as absolution. I kept thinking I'd tell you, but every time you were heading out the door or falling asleep or checking if we could afford one more expense. She looked at me, not unkindly. I needed a husband. I got a provider. I built the raft, I said. You set it on fire because you didn't like the view. She stepped closer, forehead resting against mine. Help me, she whispered. My hands almost moved on instinct, but help isn't possible when there's a second hand still on the wheel. I will not be 1/3 of my own marriage, I said. If you want me, you end it today. You send the message while I watch, then we start the hard part. Her face recoiled as though I'd asked her to cut off something vital. That's extreme. It's necessary, I replied. Half measures are just new ways to say no. Tears began again, slow and unresisting, tracking straight lines down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she said. I'm so sorry. I believed her, and I also knew her apology had stopped an inch short of action. That night we slept on opposite edges of the bed, our breaths out of sync. In the small hours, her phone lit the ceiling and went dark again. The room kept our secret. Morning would not. By breakfast, I knew the shape of my hurt. It wasn't a clean break. It was a dull, working ache, the kind that makes even simple movements costly. She reached for my hand across the table. I let her hold it because history has weight even when it's broken. I don't want to lose you, she said. Then choose me, I answered. She withdrew, not angry, not relieved, only undecided, which I realized is just another way of saying no without admitting it. We ate in a quiet that didn't feel like peace. Outside, the gulls took what the tide brought in and left the rest behind. And I knew, watching them, that some appetites will teach you to live on scraps and call it survival. I would not learn that lesson here. Marissa promised she would take some space from Damon and think. For 2 days, the air in the apartment felt a fraction lighter, like someone had cracked open a window in a long-sealed room. Her phone sat face down more often. She laughed at something I said while making coffee. And for the first time in weeks, the silence between us wasn't entirely hostile. It was just silence. But by the third night, the pings returned. Short bursts of vibration from her phone made the silverware in the dish rack tremble. At dinner, she angled the screen away from me, the faint glow illuminating her cheekbones as she smiled at something I couldn't see. It was a smile that didn't belong in this room. I set my fork down. "Can we try counseling?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "1 hour a week, I'll switch shifts." She gave a soft, almost amused exhale, not mocking, just tired. "Therapy is for people who still believe something can be fixed," she said. "I do," I told her. She lifted her water glass. "I'm not sure I do." And that was the end of it, sealed like a letter she refused to open. Nights thinned out. On the evening, she came home late from meetings. She showered with the door locked, the sound of water stretching longer than it needed to. When she slid into bed, it was always facing the wall. I tried once to wrap an arm around her, and she stiffened, whispering, "Not tonight." The way she said it wasn't annoyed, it was final, so I let go. And slowly, that space between us hardened into habit. I held on to my own routines, packing Noah's lunch for daycare, grinding coffee at 5:30 a.m., hustling through the warehouse until my back ached, then driving strangers across the city under the glow of streetlights. I told myself endurance was love with a clock on it. I told myself Damon was a phase, that it would burn out on its own oxygen. I told myself many things that sounded like hope and felt like weather. The first time I saw Damon up close, I wasn't ready for it. It was outside Marissa's office building. I had forgotten my stainless tumbler on the counter and thought I'd surprise her with coffee. She walked out of the lobby laughing, her hand resting lightly on a man's forearm as if it were the only stable railing in a slick stairwell. Damon was taller than me, sharply dressed, every line of his suit clean enough to cut. He listened with his chin tucked slightly down, like a man who measured his worth by the weight of other people's words. Marissa spotted me and stepped back from him so fast she almost dropped her tote bag. "You're early," she said, voice bright and brittle. "I brought you a latte." I handed it to her. Damon smiled politely, the kind of smile you give when you want to leave no trace. His handshake was brief, dry, managerial. "Damon, this is my husband, Ethan," Marissa said. The word husband sounded less like a declaration and more like a reminder. "Good to meet you," he said. "We were just heading to a client call." "I thought you had admin today," I said to her. "Plans change." She sipped the latte without tasting it, her eyes already following him toward the curb. That night, while Noah stacked blocks on the rug, I set a simple boundary. "I need no contact for a month," I told her. 30 days. If at the end of that you feel nothing for me, I'll accept it. But I need the noise to stop so I can hear what's left. Her eyes filled but didn't spill. "You left me alone for a year, Ethan, not physically, emotionally. I'm trying to feel like a person again." "I was breaking myself to keep us afloat," I said, "and I was drowning quietly." She shook her head. "I can't promise no contact, not right now." The word "can't" was a hinge, and on the other side of it, the door to our life swung wider for him. She started sleeping with her phone under the pillow. When she cooked, she wore wireless earbuds. She took calls on the balcony even when it rained, claiming the cool air helped her think. When I reached for her waist as she passed, her body shifted, muscle memory trained to avoid mine. My patience began to fray into threads. I stopped offering comforts she wouldn't take. I moved to the couch under the pretense of early alarms and a sore back. From there, the apartment sounded different. The deep thud of the pipes, the gentle hum of the fridge, the faint creak of her footsteps at odd hours. I started keeping a journal. A slim notebook hidden under the couch cushion, its pages filled with dates, times, and neutral, court-ready language. 10:42 p.m. Balcony call, 15 minutes, laughter. I hated myself for logging love like inventory, but I needed a witness. Sometimes the only witness available is yourself. One Wednesday, I offered something simple. Burgers at Maple's, just us. No talk about him. She tucked her hair behind her ear. I have a girls' night, rain check. The lie came without venom, just habit. Later, the shared family calendar betrayed her. Dinner at Harbor House, 7:30 p.m. The reservation held her initials and Damon's last name. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then took Noah to the park. I pushed the swing higher than usual so his laughter could drown out everything else. When he was asleep, I drove to Harbor House and parked across the street. Through the window, I saw the version of my wife that loved oysters and candlelight. She told stories with her hands, leaned forward at the punchline, her smile easy. Damon's hand rested near hers on the linen like a promise rehearsing its signature. I didn't go in. There's a kind of self-respect that looks like restraint. At midnight, she came home, her steps careful on the hardwood. I was awake, motionless on the couch, a lighthouse deciding whether to keep the beam steady or let the fog have its way. She paused beside me. Are you awake? Yes. I don't want to fight. We don't fight, I said. We avoid. I need time. You've had it, I replied quietly. And you're spending it with him. She didn't answer. Somewhere in the apartment, a pipe clicked and Noah turned over in his sleep. I stared at the ceiling and understood something simple. Brutal patience can become surrender when the other person uses it to furnish a second home. I wouldn't storm. I wouldn't beg. I would gather, prepare, and choose a day that belonged to me. By morning, I had a plan, a consultation at the start, a decision at the end. I kissed Noah's hair, brewed coffee strong enough to hold a spoon, and printed what I'd logged. The stack was thin but honest. It would grow. And so would my resolve. The kitchen was still when I sat down, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint, steady tick of the clock on the wall. Morning light hadn't fully claimed the room yet. Instead, shadows pooled in the corners as if they too were holding their breath. I'd been rehearsing this conversation in my head for days. Turning over each word like a blade I needed to keep sharp, shaping it so it could cut cleanly without wasting its edge on anger. When Marissa came in, she tossed her bag onto the counter without glancing at me. Her phone was in her hand, her thumb resting just above the screen like she was mid-thought in a conversation I wasn't invited to. She was about to pass me by when I spoke. I can't keep living like this, I said. My voice was steady, but each syllable carried the weight of weeks spent in silence. You need to make a choice. Either cut Damon out of your life completely and work on our marriage, or I walk away. She froze mid-step. Her hand stayed on the strap of her purse, fingers curling slightly as if gripping it could anchor her in this moment. The air between us thickened, pressing against my ribs. Her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. There was something there, a flicker I couldn't fully name. Guilt, defiance, maybe fear, but she didn't move toward me and she didn't look away either. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost fragile. I need time to think. It wasn't an answer. Not really. It was the same delay I'd been fed for months, dressed in slightly softer words. The sound of it landed in my gut like a cold stone, dragging down whatever hope I'd been clinging to. I realized in that moment that she wasn't ready to let him go. Maybe she never would be. That night, we moved around the apartment like strangers occupying the same rental. Every movement had weight. Every glance felt loaded with unspoken accusations and unspent anger. Even the sound of her closing a cupboard door seemed to echo louder than it should. In bed, we lay on opposite edges, the expanse between us a no-man's land neither of us dared to cross. I stared at the ceiling, the shadow of the ceiling fan slowly rotating above me like the steady tick of a clock I could no longer ignore. I knew, really knew, that time wouldn't change her mind. It would only give her more room to keep living in both worlds, while I remained trapped in one. And for the first time, I understood that this wasn't only about betrayal anymore. It was about survival, my own. The first snow of December fell in soft, deliberate sheets across our cul-de-sac, turning porch lights into hazy halos. It was the kind of morning that used to mean warmth, cinnamon rolls in the oven, laughter from the living room, Marissa humming along to carols. But this year, the house felt colder. I woke early, careful not to wake Noah, and padded into the kitchen in wool socks. The silence was thick enough to hear the faint creak of the floorboards under my feet. I started the cinnamon rolls the way Marissa used to, extra brown sugar, a ribbon of vanilla in the glaze, hoping the smell might trick the house into remembering. Our son shuffled in, his hair a tangle of sleep, blanket trailing behind him like a cape. "Where's Mom?" he asked. I kept my eyes on the baking dish. She had plans today. What plans? It's Christmas. The word sat heavy in my chest. "She'll call," I said. "Come set the table, buddy." We lit the tree, its colored lights reflecting in the window like tiny fragments of memory. The ornaments hung where we had placed them together. First Christmas in our old apartment, the ceramic angel from the street fair, the glass globe from the year Noah was born. Each one a story, each one a reminder. I turned on a playlist of carols, telling myself not to check my phone. But habit is a stubborn thing. No message from Marissa. The cinnamon rolls came out perfect, golden, the glaze catching the morning light. But the taste was wrong. We ate quietly, the warmth of the food clashing with the chill that had settled inside the room. Outside, the neighborhood was alive with laughter, the sound of children sledding, the bark of a dog chasing someone through the snow. Inside, it was just us. Mid-morning, I was kneeling by the tree, handing Noah his presents, doing silly voices for the action figures, asking mock-serious questions about whether anyone had seen a certain suspicious-looking box that might contain a robot. I laughed until the sound felt almost real. Then my phone buzzed. A notification banner slid across the top of the screen. "Marissa, new post." I didn't mean to tap it, but the photo loaded before I could stop myself. A smear of red, a blur of golden lights. Then her face, sharp, beautiful, lit by the gold glow of a hotel lobby tree. She wore the long winter coat I'd bought her last year, collar turned up. Her cheek rested against Damon's shoulder. His hand curved around her waist, casual, possessive. The caption, "New Traditions, New Year." It hit like a slap. "Dad," Noah was holding a new book, eyes wide. "Can we read this one?" I locked the phone so quickly it almost slipped from my hand. "Absolutely." My voice was steady, but I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. We curled up on the couch, reading about a train, a snowstorm, and a kid who saves the day. I let the rhythm of the words carry me, but even in the quiet between paragraphs, the image came back, her smile angled toward him, his hand resting like it had always belonged there. At noon, we bundled up for the hill behind the school. The air bit at our cheeks, but Noah's laughter as the sled flew down the slope cut through the cold. For a while, I could almost forget. Back home, the house smelled of turkey chili simmering on the stove. The phone buzzed again, a text from a friend who'd seen the post. "You okay, man?" No punctuation, just raw concern. I typed and erased 3 times before shoving the phone into my pocket. Later, we called my parents. I angled the camera so they saw the tree, not the empty space beside me. My mother's voice was warm, expectant. "Where's Marissa?" she asked. "She's visiting a friend," I said. My father's pause was noticeable, but he didn't press. When the call ended, the room felt quieter than before. A strand of lights on the tree flickered once and went dark. I pulled the broken string free and held the bulbs in my hand. They were cold, opaque, dead without their current. I scrolled back to the post. The comments were a mix of hearts and compliments. "Gorgeous couple, you two deserve all the happiness." And then Damon's reply, a single sparkle emoji. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the ease. The way they could rewrite me out of the story without hesitation. "Dad." Noah stood in the doorway holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate, marshmallows bobbing like tiny boats. "You did this?" I asked, crouching to take one from him. "Extra marshmallows, the way Mom does." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "The way you do now." That night, after he fell asleep on the couch during a movie, I carried him to bed, tucking the blanket under his chin. The glow from the hallway light fell across his face, and I thought about what I would tell him someday, how to survive a truth that doesn't care if you're ready for it. And my phone lit up one last time before midnight. Marissa, hope the day went okay. I'll be back before New Year's. It read like a calendar reminder. I didn't reply. Instead, I sat at the table, watching the tree lights blink in their slow, steady rhythm. The house had a heartbeat. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't hers. And for the first time, I let that feel like the beginning of something else. The house was too quiet that night, the kind of silence that doesn't bring peace but sits on your chest like a weight. The Christmas tree still stood in the corner, its lights blinking lazily, each flicker feeling more like mockery than celebration. I sat on the couch, the half-empty bottle of bourbon catching the tree's light in fractured glints. Every sip burned, but not enough to cauterize the image that had been looping in my mind since Christmas morning. Marissa leaning into Damon, her cheek pressed against his shoulder as if it had always belonged there. The hours slid past, each one tightening the coil inside me. I thought about calling her, about shouting every word I'd been holding back. But I knew how that would go. She'd talk in circles. She'd blame my tone. She'd remind me of my own mistakes until the conversation was no longer about her choices. By the time midnight arrived, the air in the apartment felt stale, like I'd been breathing the same unspoken words for months. I couldn't stay in it any longer. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and let the door slam shut behind me. The bar was dim and warm, the kind of place where the lighting is low enough for strangers to forget themselves. The smell of whiskey and fried food clung to the air. I slid onto a stool, ordered another drink, and let the first few gulps blur the edges of my thoughts. That's when I noticed her. Dark hair, confident smile, eyes that lingered just a little too long. She didn't look away when our gazes met. Her name was Chloe. She wasn't Marissa, and maybe that was the point. We talked in that way you talk to someone you know you'll never have to explain yourself to. Light, surface level, safe in its lack of depth. We laughed, and the sound felt foreign in my own mouth. One drink turned into two, then three. The warmth of the bourbon mixed with the warm press of her hand against my arm. By the time we stepped out into the cold night air, my mind wasn't on Damon or Marissa. It was on the feeling of choosing something for myself, even if it was reckless. Her apartment was small, tidy, lit by a single lamp in the corner. We didn't talk much once the door closed. It wasn't love, and it wasn't about her. It was about control. It was about taking something back, even if just for one night. But as dawn seeped into the room, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of what I'd done settling over me like the morning chill. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt different, stronger in one way, more broken in another. Maybe both. It happened the very next evening. I was in the kitchen rinsing out a glass, the soft rush of water the only sound in the apartment, when the front door slammed open so hard it rattled the picture frames on the wall. Marissa stood in the doorway, her face flushed, her eyes wide and blazing. She gripped her phone in one hand like it was a weapon. Her breathing was sharp, shallow, like she'd sprinted all the way here. "You're a disgusting hypocrite," she spat before I could even open my mouth. I froze, the glass still in my hand, water running unchecked into the sink. "What are you talking about? Don't you dare play dumb with me." Her voice cracked with the force of it, tears already trembling at the edge. She tossed something onto the counter, a small black device. I didn't recognize it at first, but then the shape clicked into place, a GPS tracker. "You put that on my car?" I asked slowly, the disbelief in my voice curling into something sharper. "I knew something was off," she snapped. "And guess what? I was right. Last night you were at her place. Don't even try to deny it." I stared at her, not stunned that she knew, but at the sheer audacity of her outrage. "Marissa, you've been sleeping with Damon for months, and you're mad at me for one night?" Her expression twisted, pain, anger, something almost like desperation tangled together. "That's different," shouted, her voice breaking. "You God, you've destroyed everything. I was going to tell him it was over. I was going to come back to you." I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. You were spending Christmas with him, posting pictures like you're the perfect couple, and now you expect me to believe you were coming back." Her voice softened for a fraction of a second, trembling. "I still love you, Ethan, but what you did—" She stopped herself, choking on the words. Her tears spilled over and she wiped them away with the heel of her hand. "It's unforgivable." I took a breath, and in that pause something shifted in me. The guilt I'd been carrying since that night with Chloe began to dissolve under the weight of her hypocrisy. "No, Marissa," I said quietly, the words landing heavier than a shout. "What's unforgivable is everything you did before I ever stepped foot in that bar." She stared at me, lips pressed tight, her tears still falling in silent lines. And for the first time I saw it, beneath the fury, beneath the accusations, there was fear. Not fear of losing me, fear of losing control over me. And in that moment, I realized something simple and liberating. I didn't have to play by her rules anymore. In the days after our confrontation, the air between us changed. Not calmer, not exactly louder, but heavier. It was like walking through a house where every room was rigged with invisible tripwires. One wrong move and the explosion would come. Marissa became careful, too careful. She moved through the apartment with a practiced grace, each word she spoke measured like a chess player counting the squares ahead. One morning, she set a steaming mug of coffee in front of me without being asked. "Thought you might want this," she said, smiling faintly. It wasn't kindness. It was a gesture meant to disarm, to make me second-guess my anger. That night she brought up Damon, not in confession, not in remorse, but in a way designed to test me. "You know," she said casually, "he's been giving me space. He understands me better than anyone." I didn't take the bait. I simply nodded, kept my eyes on my dinner, and let her words dissolve into the sound of cutlery on plates. The next day, my phone buzzed while I was in the shower. When I came out, it was lying face up on the counter, exactly where I hadn't left it. She was at the stove, humming. "Your friend Chloe says hi," she said without turning around. It wasn't a question, it was a probe. I set the phone down beside me and said nothing. Let her think what she wanted. By the weekend, her tactics had shifted again. She started talking about the past, how we met, the trips we'd taken, the way I used to make her laugh until she couldn't breathe. Her eyes would soften, her voice dipping into nostalgia just enough to make it hurt. Then she'd pivot. "We could get back there, you know, if you wanted." It wasn't an offer, it was a dare. I realized the pattern. She wasn't trying to reconcile or even win me back. She was trying to keep me suspended between guilt and longing, long enough for her to decide what she wanted. And so I changed my own game. I stopped reacting. When she poked, I didn't flinch. When she dangled warmth, I didn't reach for it. I became a mirror, reflecting, not absorbing. It unnerved her. I could see it in the way her smile faltered when I didn't rise to her bait, in the edge that crept into her voice when her stories fell flat. One night, she cornered me in the hallway. "What do you want from me, Ethan? Forgiveness? Punishment? What?" I met her gaze steady. "I want the truth, and I want my life back, whichever way that ends up looking." She blinked as if I'd answered in a language she didn't speak. Because the truth was, she didn't want me to have my life back. She wanted me to live in hers, under her terms, by her rules, caught in her push and pull. And for the first time, I could see the strings. Once you see the strings, the puppet show stops being magic. It happened on a Tuesday night, ordinary in every way except for how it ended. The day had been long, the kind of day where the warehouse felt like it had no air, and every delivery took twice as long. I came home with that bone-deep fatigue that makes even the sound of your own keys hitting the counter feel too loud. Marissa was already there, sitting cross-legged on the couch with her laptop open, a glass of wine balanced dangerously close to the edge of the coffee table. She didn't look up when I walked in. The only acknowledgement was the faint lift of her eyebrow, like she was measuring the temperature in the room without needing to ask a single question. Noah was asleep at my mother's for the night. That meant it was just us, no buffer, no small voice breaking up the tension. I cooked a quick dinner in silence, plating her portion out of habit more than intention. She glanced at it but didn't move her laptop. "You didn't have to," she said flatly. "I know," I replied. Halfway through the meal, her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. She tried to angle it away, but I caught the name. Damon, again. Something inside me snapped, not with a shout, not with a slammed fist, but with a quiet, decisive click like the last tooth of a lock falling into place. Answer it, I said. My voice didn't rise. Her fork froze midair. What? Answer it. Put him on speaker. She stared at me, gauging whether I was serious. When she realized I was, her expression shifted. First defiance, then something closer to panic. That's ridiculous, she said. What's ridiculous is pretending we still have a marriage while you keep feeding him pieces of yourself. Her eyes narrowed. You don't get to control who I talk to. No, I said, leaning forward, but I get to decide if I stay married to someone who talks to him. For a moment, neither of us moved. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space between our breaths. Then she shoved her plate away and stood, pacing the living room. This is exactly why I can't stand being around you anymore, she said, her voice rising. It's always demands, ultimatums. It's boundaries, I cut in. The kind you should have set long before you climbed into his bed. Her face went pale, but her eyes burned. You think you're perfect. You think what you did with Chloe is any different. It's exactly different, I said. Because mine was a reaction to betrayal. Yours was the betrayal. That was when her hand twitched toward the wine glass, too fast, too sharp, and for a split second I thought she might throw it. Instead, she gripped it so tightly the stem looked ready to snap. Get out, she whispered. It wasn't rage in her voice now, it was something colder. I stood my chair scraping the floor and took my keys from the counter. No, you get out tomorrow, I'll pack your things. She flinched like I'd struck her, but I didn't stop. I walked to the bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. My hands were steady. My pulse was not. On the other side of the door, I could hear her moving, slamming drawers, muttering words I couldn't make out. Every sound felt like the final nails being driven into something we had both already buried. I sat on the bed, the weight of it all pressing into me, and realized this wasn't just the breaking point for us. It was the breaking point for me, where the hope finally gave way to something stronger. Resolve. The morning after our confrontation, the apartment felt like a place abandoned in a hurry. Marissa was already awake, pacing the bedroom when I opened the door. A half-packed suitcase sat on the bed, clothes spilling over the sides like they were trying to escape before she could decide otherwise. The sharp scent of her perfume hung in the air, too strong for that early hour. It was the scent she wore when she needed armor. You really want me gone? She asked, not looking up from the drawer she was rifling through. Yes, I said without hesitation. She laughed short, bitter, the kind that's more exhale than sound. You think this makes you strong, kicking me out? No, I replied evenly. It makes me sane. She stuffed more clothes into the suitcase, zipping it halfway before remembering something in the closet. I leaned against the door frame, watching her move, noting how her hands trembled when she thought I wasn't looking. The silence between us wasn't the same as before. It wasn't loaded with the hope of fixing things or the fear of breaking them further. It was final. By noon, she had gathered most of her belongings, at least the ones she couldn't live without. A few framed photos disappeared from the bookshelf, her favorite mugs from the kitchen counter, the wool coat I'd bought her 3 Christmases ago. When she reached for the picture of us on our wedding day, I stopped her. That stays, I said. She met my eyes for a long moment, then set it back on the shelf without a word. We didn't argue about the logistics. She knew where she was going. I knew I wouldn't ask. The details didn't matter anymore. At the door, she paused with her hand on the handle. You'll regret this, she said softly, like she was stating a fact, not making a threat. I shook my head. I already regret too much. She didn't reply. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound sharper than I expected, echoing through the apartment. For a long time, I stood in the entryway, staring at the space where her suitcase had been, the faint trace of her perfume still lingering like an afterimage. Then I started moving. I opened windows. I stripped the bed. I gathered everything she had left behind into a single pile in the corner of the bedroom. It wasn't about anger. It was about reclaiming the space. By the time the sun dipped low, the apartment felt lighter, still haunted, still echoing with the shape of what had been, but lighter. And for the first time in months, I could take a deep breath without feeling like I was stealing it from someone else. It started small, barely noticeable at first. A coworker giving me a look that lasted half a second too long. A neighbor offering a smile that felt more like pity than kindness. A casual text from an old friend, the tone just a little too careful. At first, I told myself it was nothing, but the pattern grew. By the end of the week, I understood Marissa was talking, not to me, of course, to everyone else. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to post anything outright. All it took was a carefully chosen detail here, an insinuation there, tiny, sharp hooks disguised as conversation. She was building a story where she was the wounded one, the loyal wife who had tried everything, the victim of a husband's coldness and impulsive betrayal. And the thing about a whisper is, it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be repeated enough times in enough ears until it feels like it could be. I heard pieces of it secondhand. She said you were distant for years. She said you shut her out. She said she only turned to Damon when you gave her no choice. No one came to me for my side. They didn't have to. The version she was telling was easier to believe. I knew why she was doing it. This wasn't about salvaging anything between us. It was about controlling the narrative. She wanted to make sure that when people thought of us, they saw me as the man who drove her into someone else's arms. The cruelty was in the precision. She never accused me of anything that could be disproven outright. She didn't need to lie entirely, just twist the truth until it bent into her shape. I should have been furious, and part of me was. But another part of me, colder, sharper, recognized this for what it was, a move in a longer game. Because if she wanted to play in the shadows, I could play there too. I started documenting everything, dates, times, conversations, not just with her but with anyone who repeated her words to me. I asked questions that seemed harmless but were designed to confirm exactly what she'd said and to whom. I collected names, stored screenshots, saved voicemails. I didn't fight the whispers directly. That would only feed them. Instead, I let them circulate, let them build. And while they did, I worked quietly, methodically, on a plan to make sure that when the truth came out, it wouldn't just clear my name, it would burn hers down to the foundation. And the best part, she wouldn't see it coming. I didn't announce my move. I let the whispers keep circulating, let Marissa feel like she was winning. That was the beauty of patience. It made the moment of impact all the more devastating. The first step was quiet, a dinner with two mutual friends who had been noticeably distant since the separation. We met at a small Italian place downtown, the kind with low lighting and white tablecloths. I didn't bring it up right away. I let the conversation wander, work, sports, the weather, until one of them finally said, "Look, Ethan, we've heard things." I leaned back, nodded slowly. "I'm sure you have. You probably heard I pushed her away, that I left her no choice, that I destroyed us." I kept my voice calm, almost tired. "But let me show you something." From my coat pocket, I slid a small folder across the table. Inside were printouts, screenshots of her messages to Damon while we were still sharing a bed, timestamps from nights she told me she was working late, photos from Christmas morning when she was supposed to be with us but was with him. They read in silence. One of them glanced at me, the other at the folder. Neither said a word for nearly a full minute. "I'm not asking you to pick sides," I said finally. "I'm just asking you to know the truth before you decide who to believe." By the time dessert came, their tone had shifted. They asked questions, careful ones at first, then sharper, as if the reality they thought they knew was unraveling in their hands. Over the next week, I repeated the process, one conversation at a time. A neighbor who had stopped waving, a cousin who had gone radio silent, a coworker who had started avoiding the break room when I walked in. Each time, I handed over the evidence. Not with anger, not with venom, but with the steady composure of a man who has nothing to hide. And slowly, the tide turned. I began to notice it in subtle ways. People who had once offered only tight-lipped greetings now stopped to talk. A friend I hadn't heard from in months called just to check in. Even my mother mentioned that someone from her book club had told her they might have misjudged me. The beauty of truth is that it doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be seen. Of course, I knew this would get back to Marissa. That was the point. And when it did, she'd realize that the quiet man she thought she could bury under her story wasn't just still standing. He was digging her out of the shadows she'd built around herself. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming my name, my life, and I wasn't done yet. It came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when the sky hung low and the streets shimmered with the reflection of headlights on wet pavement. I was leaving work, collar turned up against the drizzle, when I heard my name. Ethan! I turned, half expecting another confrontation, another thinly veiled accusation. Instead, I saw someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Lauren. Lauren had been Marissa's friend long before I came into the picture. They'd gone to college together, been roommates for a time. She'd been at our wedding in our home on our vacations. But somewhere in the last year, she drifted toward Marissa's inner circle, the one I assumed was now fully against me. "Can we talk?" she asked, stepping closer under the shelter of a shop awning. I hesitated. About what? About what she's been saying, and about what I know. We ducked into a small coffee shop, the kind that smelled like roasted beans and rain-soaked coats. I ordered us both something hot just to buy time to read her face. She looked tired, but not in the way people do from lack of sleep. This was a heavier kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying something you're not supposed to say. "She's been telling people you ruined the marriage," Lauren began. "That you were cold, controlling, that she had no choice but to find comfort with Damon." I didn't respond, I just waited. "But here's the thing," she continued, lowering her voice. She was seeing Damon almost a year before she ever said a word about being unhappy, and she wasn't just with him. She was planning a life with him. She told me she wanted to leave you once she was sure he'd commit. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. "Why are you telling me this now?" Lauren's gaze dropped to her coffee. "Because I thought she was telling me the truth back then. I believed her. But the way she's spinning the story now, she's leaving out everything that makes her look bad, and I'm done helping her do it." I studied her for a moment. "You know, if you say this to anyone else, she'll turn on you." "She already has," Lauren said quietly. "She told Damon I can't be trusted, which is funny because she trusted me with everything until I stopped nodding along." She reached into her bag and slid a small envelope across the table. "You might want these." Inside were printed screenshots, texts from Marissa to Damon, plans for trips she told me were work conferences, even a message where she laughed about how easy it was to keep me in the dark. I let out a slow breath. "Why give these to me?" "Because the truth matters," she said simply. "And because you're not the villain here, Ethan, you never were." We sat in silence for a moment, the rain pattering softly against the window. When we finally stood to leave, she gave me a small, almost apologetic smile. "Do what you need to with them. Just be careful. Marissa doesn't fight fair." As I walked back into the rain, the envelope tucked safely inside my jacket, I realized something important. Sometimes the person you least expect to stand beside you is the one holding the piece that changes the whole game. After months of surviving on instinct, dodging lies, countering rumors, collecting truths, I finally felt the ground under my feet again. It wasn't solid yet, but it was there. The first step was physical. I needed to reclaim my space, my body, my daily rhythm. I cleared out the last of Marissa's things, not just the obvious reminders like clothes or perfume, but the hidden traces. The mug tucked behind the others in the kitchen cabinet, the scarf crumpled in the back of a drawer, the stray hairpin wedged in the couch cushion. Each piece went into a box I taped shut without ceremony. The apartment felt different after that, lighter, quieter. My mornings became my own again. I brewed coffee without wondering if she'd roll out of bed to join me. I played music I actually liked. I left my phone wherever I wanted without worrying about whose name might appear on the screen. I turned my focus to my health. The gym became a second home, not for revenge or to prove anything to anyone, but because I wanted to feel strong in my own skin again. The first weeks were brutal, muscles protesting, lungs burning, but the progress was addictive. I watched the numbers on the weights climb, my reflection shifting from someone worn down to someone who could meet his own eyes without flinching. Socially, I started small. Dinner with my brother. A movie night with old friends I'd lost touch with. At first, I caught myself scanning conversations for hidden judgments, waiting for someone to bring up Marissa. But over time, those moments faded. People started asking about me, not about her, not about us, just me. I also went back to old hobbies that had been shelved during the marriage. Photography, for one. There was something grounding about holding a camera, framing a moment exactly the way I wanted to remember it. I wandered through the city on weekends, capturing sunlit streets, weathered brick walls, strangers' faces caught in candid laughter. And slowly, the fog in my head began to clear. The anger didn't vanish overnight. Some days it still flared, especially when her name came up unexpectedly or I caught wind of a fresh twist in her version of our story. But the difference was this. I wasn't living inside that anger anymore. I realized that rebuilding wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to let it define the rest of my life. One evening, standing on my balcony with a mug of tea, I watched the city lights blink on one by one. I thought about the man I had been a year ago, tired, blind, holding onto something that was already slipping away. And I thought about the man I was becoming, steadier, clearer, no longer asking for permission to exist on his own terms. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of it. It started innocently enough, a chance meeting at a friend's gathering. Her name was Anna. She wasn't the kind of person who demanded attention the second she walked into a room. She was the kind who made you notice her twice, first for her quiet presence, then for the way her smile seemed to warm the space around her. We were introduced over a table crowded with coffee cups and half-eaten pastries. The conversation began with the usual small talk, work, hobbies, mutual acquaintances, but there was an ease to it like we were skipping steps without even trying. Over the next few weeks, we crossed paths more often. A group dinner here, a volunteer event there. Each time I caught myself lingering just a little longer in her company, drawn to the way she listened, not just to reply, but to understand. It wasn't like with Marissa. There was no performance, no calculated charm. With Anna, I didn't feel the need to measure my words or guard my expressions. I could simply exist, and that was enough. One rainy Saturday, we ended up sharing a cab home from a mutual friend's party. The city outside was blurred into streaks of light, the quiet inside the car broken only by the hum of the engine. She told me about the time she'd traveled alone to Italy, how she'd gotten lost in a small village and ended up being invited to a family dinner by complete strangers. I laughed, and she smiled at the sound. For a moment, I forgot about everything else. The past, the damage, the rules I'd set for myself. When the cab pulled up to my building, she hesitated before saying good night. There was a question in her eyes, one I felt in my chest but wasn't ready to answer. Later, lying in bed, I thought about that moment, about how easy it would be to step into something new, to let myself be carried by the rush of possibility. But I also knew the danger of rushing in too soon, the temptation to use new love as a bandage for wounds that hadn't fully healed. Anna was not a distraction. She was the kind of person who deserved more than to be someone's rebound. So I decided to wait, to let the connection grow at its own pace without forcing it into a shape it wasn't ready for. Still, I couldn't deny the truth. For the first time since Marissa, I felt something stirring in me again. And it scared me in the best possible way. The final meeting wasn't planned in any romantic or poetic way. It was practical, necessary. We met at the lawyer's office to sign the last of the divorce papers. The room was bland, cream walls, a faint smell of paper and toner, the low hum of the air conditioner. The kind of place where even emotions seemed to sit quietly, waiting their turn. Marissa was already there when I walked in. She wore a navy dress, understated but deliberate. Her hair was pinned back, makeup subtle. She looked composed, but I knew her well enough to see the tightness in her jaw. We didn't hug. We didn't shake hands. We sat on opposite sides of the table while the lawyer went over the documents, explaining in a neutral tone what each page meant. I signed my name where it needed to be. She did the same. The sound of the pen scratching on paper was louder than it should have been. When it was over, the lawyer left us alone for a moment, stepping out to make copies. The silence that followed wasn't tense, it was empty. Marissa was the first to speak. "So this is it." I nodded. "Yeah, this is it." She looked at me, then really looked. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, regret maybe, or nostalgia, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same guarded expression she'd worn for months. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for," she said softly. I could have said 100 things in that moment. I could have reminded her of the damage, the betrayal, the way she'd rewritten our story for her own survival, but none of it mattered anymore. "I already am," I replied. She gave a small nod as if that was the only answer she'd expected. Then she stood, gathering her purse and coat. At the door, she paused, not turning around, but holding still for just a second longer than she needed to, before walking out. When the door clicked shut behind her, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't relief. It wasn't grief. It was space. Space in my chest where the weight had been. Space in my life where the constant noise had lived. Space in my future where her shadow no longer reached. And in that space, I could breathe. The morning was cool, the air crisp enough to wake every sense without needing coffee. Anna and I walked side by side along the park's winding path, the early sun spilling gold across the grass. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The quiet between us wasn't heavy. It was easy, the kind that feels like a warm blanket rather than a wall. A light breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked and its owner laughed. The sound made Anna smile, and I found myself smiling too without even thinking about it. Every step felt like a small affirmation that I had survived, that I had rebuilt, that I was finally moving forward. At one point, Anna stopped to watch a cluster of ducks glide across the pond. She didn't say anything, just tilted her head slightly, eyes catching the light. I stood beside her, and for the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't thinking about what came next. I was simply here. The months leading to this moment had been a storm, full of betrayal, anger, loss, and hard truths. But storms don't last forever. Eventually, the clouds break, the air clears, and the world feels new again. I glanced at Anna. She caught my eye and gave me a small, knowing smile. Not a promise, not a question, just an understanding. We kept walking, the path curving ahead into the sunlight. Whatever the future held, whether it was friendship, love, or something in between, I knew this much. I had learned the value of my own worth, the strength of my boundaries, and the freedom of living on my own terms. And as the day unfolded around us, I realized I wasn't just stepping into a new morning. I was stepping into a new life. And that was the end of She betrayed me first, but my revenge made her lose everything. In the end, betrayal doesn't just break trust, it changes you. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying someone else's life, it's rebuilding your own without them in it. But here's the question. If you were in my shoes, would you have walked away or made them pay? I want to hear what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments like this video if it kept you hooked. And make sure you're subscribed to Cheating Stories 7 for more stories like this, because the next one might just top this. Until then, take care of your heart, guard your trust, and remember, not all endings are losses.